I was 7 years old when I first learned that saying no to adults could get you hurt, but it wasn't until my own 7-year-old son Tommy sat at my grandmother's Christmas dinner table with red wine dripping from his face that I truly understood the cost of standing up for yourself. My father Robert stood over my child with an empty glass in his hand, while my brother Jake actually laughed at what had just happened. The entire room had gone silent except for the sound of burgundy droplets hitting the hardwood floor. Tommy's new Christmas sweater was ruined, his small face streaked with tears and wine, but his eyes held something that broke my heart completely. Betrayal. Not just from the wine throwing, but from watching adults he trusted turn against him for one simple word. That single moment would shatter every assumption I had about family loyalty and teach me that protecting your child sometimes means walking away from everyone you thought you could count on. Earlier that morning, everything had started so differently. I remember standing in my apartment bathroom at 6:30, shaving carefully, while Tommy bounced on my bed in his new Christmas pajamas. The red flannel ones with little reindeer that he had picked out specifically for today. For 3 months he had been talking about Christmas at great-grandma Dorothy's house. It would be his first holiday there since my divorce from Sarah became final, and he was practically vibrating with excitement. "Dad, can I bring my helicopter to show Kyle?" He asked for the 20th time, clutching the remote control aircraft that had cost me 3 months of careful saving. I worked as an insurance adjuster, and after child support and rent on our small 2-bedroom apartment, there wasn't much left for extras. But seeing Tommy's face light up when he saw that helicopter in the store window made every dollar worth it. "Of course, buddy. Just remember what we talked about taking care of your things." The drive to Dorothy's house in suburban Denver took 45 minutes through light snow. Tommy pressed his nose against the window, watching the flakes dust the pine trees along Highway 6. Dorothy had lived in the same brick ranch house for 57 years, ever since she married my grandfather William. The place held 4 generations of Christmas memories from my father's childhood in the 1970s to Tommy's first steps around her coffee table just 6 years ago. When we arrived, the driveway was already crowded. Jake's black pickup truck sat next to our father Robert's silver sedan. Christmas lights outlined every window and door frame, just like Dorothy had done every December since I could remember. The smell of honey ham drifted from the kitchen as we knocked on the front door. "There's my favorite great-grandson." Dorothy's voice carried across the entryway as she enveloped Tommy in a hug that lifted his feet off the ground. At 84, she still moved with surprising energy, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. "I'm your only great-grandson, Grandma Dorothy." Tommy giggled, using the name he had called her since he learned to talk. "That makes you extra special." She winked, leading us into the living room where the rest of the family had gathered. Jake stood by the fireplace with his wife Brenda and their 8-year-old son Kyle. My brother looked exactly like our father had 20 years ago, tall and broad with the same receding hairline and permanent frown lines. Brenda managed a dental office and always dressed like she was heading to a business meeting even on Christmas morning. Kyle bounced between his parents, already hyper from whatever breakfast sugar Dorothy had fed him. "Atlas, good to see you," Jake said, but his handshake felt mechanical. "How's the new apartment working out?" "It's perfect for us," I replied, ignoring the subtle dig about downsizing after the divorce. Robert emerged from the kitchen carrying a cup of coffee and wearing his usual expression of mild disapproval. At 58, my father had never quite figured out how to show affection without also delivering criticism. "You're later than we expected," he said instead of hello. Traffic was heavier than usual. I explained, though we were actually right on time. "Tommy, come show Kyle your helicopter," Dorothy suggested, trying to redirect the tension she could already sense building. Tommy proudly unwrapped his new toy, explaining every feature with the enthusiasm only a 7-year-old could muster. Kyle listened with growing interest, his eyes fixed on the sleek silver aircraft with its working LED lights and precision controls. "That's really cool," Kyle said. Can I fly it? Maybe later, Tommy replied politely. I haven't even tried it yet. I noticed Jake and Robert exchange a look across the room, the kind of silent communication that often happened between them. Growing up, I had learned to recognize those glances as warning signs of coordinated family interventions. Boys, why don't you play together while we finish getting dinner ready? Brenda suggested, her voice carrying the false cheerfulness she used when managing difficult patients. Dorothy always starts Christmas morning with gift opening. I said, remembering the family tradition that went back decades. Youngest to oldest, right? Well, Jake interrupted, maybe Kyle should go first this year. He's been waiting so patiently, and you know how excited kids get. Tommy looked confused. He understood family rules, and he knew that at 7 he was younger than Kyle. But he didn't argue, just clutched his helicopter a little tighter and settled onto the couch next to me. Kyle opened his presents with theatrical enthusiasm, receiving video games clothing and a new bicycle that would have to wait in the garage until spring. Each gift prompted cheers from the adults and polite applause from Tommy, who clearly wondered when his turn would come. Okay, Tommy's turn, Dorothy announced after Kyle had finished. Actually, Robert interjected, maybe we should let Kyle try out that helicopter first. You know, to make sure it works properly before Tommy gets too attached to it. The request hit me like cold water. In all my years of family Christmases, I had never seen anyone suggest testing a child's gift before letting them play with it. Tommy looked up at me with questioning eyes, not understanding why his new toy needed approval from his cousin. It's Tommy's present, I said carefully. He should get to open it and try it first. Jake stepped closer to the couch. Come on, Atlas. Family shares with each other. Kyle just wants to see how it works. And Tommy wants to play with his own toy. I replied, feeling the familiar weight of family pressure settling on my shoulders. That's when I heard it. Robert's voice, low but audible, speaking to Jake near the Christmas tree. Just like we discussed, the kid needs to learn to share or he doesn't belong here. The words hit me like a physical blow. This entire morning, this whole gathering had been planned. They hadn't invited us to celebrate Christmas. They had invited us to teach Tommy a lesson about not being worthy of family inclusion unless he gave up what belonged to him. I looked around the room with new eyes, noticing things I had missed before. The way Brenda kept glancing at her watch, how Jake positioned himself between Tommy and the front door. The fact that Dorothy kept wringing her hands, a nervous habit she only displayed when family conflict was brewing. Hey, buddy, I whispered to Tommy, hold on to your helicopter, okay? We're going to figure this out. But as Tommy nodded and hugged his gift closer to his chest, I realized we had walked into something much bigger than a simple Christmas morning disagreement. This was a test, and my son was the unwilling subject. The pressure began immediately after I realized their plan. Robert moved closer to where Tommy sat on Dorothy's floral couch, his presence suddenly feeling imposing rather than grandfatherly. Tommy, Robert said in the voice he used to use on me as a child, family members share their best things with each other. That's what makes us a family. My son looked up at his grandfather with genuine confusion. But I just got it. Grandpa Robert, I haven't even flown it yet. That's exactly the point, Jake added, settling into the armchair across from us. Kyle has been so good this year, and he's your older cousin. He should get the first turn with the nicest toy. Brenda nodded enthusiastically from her perch on the ottoman. Kyle worked really hard in school this semester. He deserves to play with something special. I watched my 7-year-old process this information, trying to understand why his brand new Christmas gift was being redistributed before he had even removed it from its box. Tommy had been taught to share, but every parenting book I had read emphasized that children needed to feel ownership before they could genuinely give to others. What if Kyle plays with it after I try it? Tommy suggested offering a compromise that showed remarkable maturity for his age. That's not how sharing works, Robert replied firmly. Real sharing means putting other people first, not yourself. Dorothy appeared in the doorway between the living room and kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel covered with dancing snowmen. Maybe the boys could take turns, she suggested gently. 10 minutes each. No, Jake said with finality. Huh, Kyle should get the first turn because he's been waiting longer. Waiting for what? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Tommy's Christmas present. Waiting for someone in this family to show some consideration for others, Robert answered, his tone carrying 30 years of accumulated disappointment in my life choices. I felt the familiar knot forming in my stomach, the same sensation I had experienced countless times growing up when family discussions turned into lectures about my failures. Since my divorce, these moments had become more frequent and more pointed. Sarah had made sure everyone knew her version of our marriage's end, painting me as selfish and financially irresponsible. Atlas always was the one who needed to learn about sharing, Brenda commented, apparently forgetting that she had known me for less than 10 years and had no insight into my childhood. Tommy looked between the adults, his small hands gripping the helicopter's box tighter with each exchange. His lower lip had begun to tremble, not from being denied his toy, but from sensing the adult hostility swirling around him. I need some air, I announced, heading toward Dorothy's back porch. Good idea, Jake called after me. Think about what's really important here. The December cold bit through my sweater as I stepped onto the wooden deck that overlooked Dorothy's backyard. Snow covered her vegetable garden and the swing set she had installed when Kyle and Tommy were toddlers. I leaned against the railing, trying to process what was happening inside. That's when I heard their voices through the kitchen window, which Dorothy had cracked open to prevent condensation while she cooked. He's gotten too big for his britches since the divorce, Robert was saying. Sarah told me he walked away with way more than he deserved. The house, the savings account, even her grandmother's china, Jake added. Meanwhile, I'm working 60 hours a week and can barely afford Kyle's school supplies. My breath caught in my throat. Sarah had been spreading lies about our divorce settlement. In reality, I had taken our small house because she didn't want the mortgage responsibility, and our savings account contained less than $3,000 after legal fees. Sarah had actually kept the china along with most of our furniture and her car. Maybe if we show him that his kid can't just take whatever he wants, Atlas will learn some humility, Robert continued. Exactly, Jake agreed. Tommy gets everything he asks for while Kyle has to make do with hand-me-downs. It's not fair. Brenda's voice joined the conversation. I told Jake we should have said something sooner. That helicopter probably cost more than we spend on Kyle's entire Christmas. I closed my eyes, finally understanding the real motivation behind the morning's events. This wasn't about teaching Tommy to share. This was about punishing me for an imaginary financial advantage while using my son as the vehicle for their resentment. Atlas has always been Dad's favorite, Jake said bitterly. Even now, he gets everything handed to him while I have to ask for help with basic bills. That ends today, Robert declared. If Tommy can't learn to put family first, then maybe they don't need to be part of family gatherings. The threat was clear. Comply with their demands or lose access to extended family relationships that Tommy treasured. I thought about my son's excitement during the drive over his innocent belief that family meant love and acceptance. Now I had to decide whether to sacrifice his dignity to maintain connections with people who were using him as a pawn in their adult grievances. I stayed outside for 10 more minutes, watching snow fall on Dorothy's bird feeders and trying to summon the courage to protect my child from people who should have been protecting him themselves. When I finally returned to the living room, Tommy was exactly where I had left him, still holding his helicopter and surrounded by adults who were treating him like an obstacle to overcome, rather than a child to cherish. Feeling better? Jake asked with false concern. Much, I replied, sitting back down next to Tommy and putting my arm around his shoulders. And I've decided that Tommy will be happy to share his helicopter with Kyle after he's had some time to enjoy it himself. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees, but I was finally ready to stand my ground. The tension that had been simmering all morning reached a boiling point during dinner. Dorothy's dining room table, usually a place of warmth and celebration, felt like a battlefield. Tommy sat to my right, his helicopter placed carefully on the floor beside his chair where he could keep an eye on it. Kyle sat directly across from us, shooting longing glances at the toy every few seconds, while his parents exchanged meaningful looks with Robert. Dorothy had outdone herself with the meal. Her famous honey-glazed ham sat at the center of the table, surrounded by sweet potato casserole, green bean almondine, and fresh dinner rolls that filled the room with the scent of yeast and butter. Under normal circumstances, this would have been exactly the kind of family gathering I wanted Tommy to remember. Instead, every bite felt forced, as the adults around us continued their campaign of subtle hostility. "Pass the gravy, please," Jake requested, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there in previous years. As I reached for the ceramic boat shaped like a turkey, Robert began his next assault. "You know, Atlas, I've been thinking about what Sarah mentioned last time we talked." My hand froze halfway to the gravy. "What about how you're spending money you don't really have? That helicopter must have cost $200, maybe more." $300. Tommy said proudly, not understanding that he was providing ammunition for his grandfather's attack. $300. Robert repeated slowly, as if the number represented a moral failing. "For a toy that a 7-year-old will probably break within a week." Brenda nodded sagely while cutting Kyle's ham into smaller pieces. "We always taught Kyle that expensive gifts create unrealistic expectations. That's why we focus on practical presents. Like the socks and underwear we saw him open earlier." I asked, immediately regretting the sarcasm in my voice. Jake's fork clattered against his plate. "At least we're teaching our son the value of money instead of showing off with flashy purchases." "I'm not showing off," I said quietly, aware that Tommy was absorbing every word of this conversation. "I'm buying my son a Christmas present that I saved for months to afford." "Months you could have been putting money into Tommy's college fund," Robert pointed out. "But I suppose immediate gratification is more important than long-term planning." The criticism hit exactly where Robert intended. I had been contributing to Tommy's college fund, but the divorce had forced me to restart from zero after Sarah cleaned out our joint accounts during the separation. $30 a month was all I could manage right now, and Robert knew it because Sarah had undoubtedly shared that information during one of their regular phone conversations. Tommy had stopped eating entirely, his attention focused on the adult conversation he didn't fully understand, but recognized as being about him. His small fingers picked at the edge of his paper napkin, tearing it into progressively smaller pieces. "Maybe we should change the subject," Dorothy suggested from the head of the table, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been managing family dynamics for 8 decades. "No, I think this needs to be addressed," Jake insisted. "Kyle has been watching his cousin get everything he wants while we teach him that money doesn't grow on trees." "That's not fair to Kyle or Tommy," Brenda added, apparently having forgotten that 30 minutes earlier she had been demanding that Kyle receive Tommy's gift. I looked at my son, who had begun to shrink into his chair as the adults discussed him like he wasn't present. His Christmas sweater, a bright red pullover with a cheerful snowman, seemed to mock the mood that had settled over the dining room. "Tommy," I said gently, "why don't you go wash your hands and then you can show Grandma Dorothy how your helicopter works?" "Actually," Robert interrupted, "I think Tommy should let Kyle try it first, since we're all family here and Kyle has been so patient." "He's been patient for 30 minutes, I replied. "Tommy has been waiting to play with his own toy since we got here 4 hours ago. And that attitude is exactly the problem." Robert's voice rose slightly. "You're teaching your son that his wants matter more than other people's feelings." Kyle, who had been watching this exchange with growing excitement, reached across the table toward where Tommy sat. "Can I just see it really quick? "No," Tommy said firmly, pulling the helicopter closer to his side of the table. "It's mine." The word hung in the air like a challenge to everything the adults had been building toward all morning. Tommy's simple assertion of ownership over his own Christmas gift had just become an act of rebellion in their eyes. "Excuse me." Robert's voice dropped to the dangerous, quiet tone I remembered from childhood punishments. I said no. Tommy repeated, his 7-year-old voice gaining strength from some reserve of courage I had never seen before. It's my present, and I want to play with it first. Jake actually smiled, but there was no humor in it. Well, I guess we know where he learned that attitude. From his father, who never learned to share either, Brenda added helpfully. Robert stood up slowly, his chair scraping against Dorothy's hardwood floor with a sound that made everyone freeze. He reached for his wine glass, a heavy crystal tumbler that Dorothy had inherited from her own mother, and I watched in slow motion as his face flushed with the kind of anger I had seen him display when dealing with difficult clients at his accounting firm. Maybe, Robert said deliberately, you need to learn what happens to children who don't respect their elders. Before I could react, before Dorothy could intervene, before Jake or Brenda could object, my father drew back his arm and hurled the contents of his wine glass directly at my son's face. The burgundy liquid hit Tommy square in the forehead, splashing across his cheeks and soaking into his Christmas sweater. Wine dripped from his hair onto his plate, mixing with the honey glaze from his untouched ham. The glass slipped from Robert's fingers and shattered against the floor, but the sound was lost beneath Tommy's sharp intake of breath. For a moment that felt like an eternity, nobody moved. Tommy sat frozen, with dark red wine streaming down his face, his eyes wide with shock and the beginning of tears. Robert remained standing, his hand still extended from the throwing motion, looking as surprised as anyone by what he had just done. Then Jake laughed. Not a nervous chuckle or an uncomfortable giggle, but an actual laugh, as if watching a 7-year-old get wine thrown at his face was the funniest thing he had seen all day. Well, Jake said between chuckles, maybe now he'll learn to share. The sound of my brother's laughter, combined with the sight of my traumatized son sitting in stunned silence, broke something fundamental inside me. I started to stand, my vision tunneling with rage, when Dorothy's voice cut through the chaos. I got every bit of that on video. Every head in the room turned toward the 84-year-old woman at the head of the table, who was holding her smartphone with steady hands and an expression I had never seen on her face before. Every word, she continued calmly. Every action. All of it. The silence that followed Dorothy's announcement was deafening. My father, who had been standing over my wine-soaked son like some kind of avenging patriarch, suddenly looked like a deer caught in headlights. Jake's laughter died in his throat, replaced by the dawning realization that his amusement at child abuse had been captured on camera. "Mom, you can't be serious," Robert said, his voice losing all its previous authority. "Deadly serious," Dorothy replied, her finger still poised over her phone's screen. "I started recording when I came back from the kitchen and heard you all pressuring this child about his Christmas present." Brenda launched into immediate damage control. "Dorothy, you don't understand the context. We were just trying to teach the boys about sharing." By throwing wine at a 7-year-old's face, Dorothy's voice carried 8 decades of maternal authority. Is that what we're calling teaching now? I was still focused on Tommy, who sat motionless with burgundy liquid dripping from his chin onto his lap. Grabbing a stack of Dorothy's cloth napkins, I began gently wiping wine from my son's face, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay, even though I had no idea if that was true. Jake made a grab for Dorothy's phone. "Mom, whatever you recorded, we need to talk about this as a family before..." "Before what?" Dorothy asked smoothly, moving her phone out of his reach with surprising agility. "Before people see how you treat children? Before they hear you laughing at a little boy getting assaulted by his grandfather." "Assaulted is a strong word," Robert protested, but his face had gone pale. "It was just discipline." "Discipline." Dorothy's voice rose for the first time all morning. "Robert James Morrison, you threw a glass of wine at your grandson's face because he wouldn't give away his Christmas present. In what universe is that discipline?" The use of Robert's full name had the same effect it used to have when we were children. My father actually took a step backwards, suddenly looking less like an authority figure and more like a guilty child caught in a terrible mistake. What exactly did you record? Brenda asked, her dental office management training kicking in as she tried to assess the scope of the problem. Dorothy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Everything. Jake's complaints about Atlas getting too much in the divorce, even though Sarah lied about that. Robert's threats about excluding Tommy from family gatherings if he didn't comply. Your comments about expensive gifts creating unrealistic expectations, Brenda. All of it. My mind reeled as I processed what Dorothy was revealing. She had not only witnessed the wine throwing, but she had heard the conversations I thought were private. She knew about their coordinated campaign against Tommy and me. You've been spying on your own family, Jake accused, but his voice lacked conviction. I've been documenting the truth, Dorothy corrected him. Something I should have done months ago when I started noticing how you all treat Atlas and Tommy differently since the divorce. Robert tried a different approach, appealing to family loyalty. Mother, I know I lost my temper, but surely we can handle this within the family. There's no need to involve outsiders. Outsiders? Dorothy laughed, but the sound held no humor. Like Child Protective Services, like the police. You're right, Robert. Let's definitely keep quiet about adults abusing children. That always works out well. The mention of official involvement sent panic through the room. Brenda began pacing between the dining room and living room, her composure finally cracking. Jake ran his hands through his hair repeatedly, a nervous habit he had developed in high school during exam periods. Look, we all got carried away, Jake said desperately. But nothing really happened. Tommy's fine, right, buddy? Tommy, who had been silent throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke. I want to go home now, Daddy. His small voice, thick with unshed tears and confusion, cut through the adults' arguments like a knife. Here was the only honest response in the room from the person who mattered most. Okay, buddy, I said, standing up and lifting Tommy into my arms. His Christmas sweater was ruined, soaked with wine, and smelling like a bar at closing time. We're leaving. Wait, Dorothy said, rising from her chair with more energy than I had seen from her in years. I'm not done yet. She looked around the room at her son, daughter-in-law, grandson, and great-grandson, and I saw something in her expression that made everyone freeze. I've been watching this family tear itself apart for months. She began, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated disappointment. I've watched you, Robert, turn bitter and mean since your divorce. I've watched you, Jake, become jealous and petty because you think life isn't fair. And I've watched both of you take out your frustrations on an innocent child who did nothing wrong except exist. Mom. Robert started to interrupt. I'm talking, Dorothy snapped with enough force to silence him immediately. I've been updating my will lately, trying to decide what to do with this house and everything William and I built together. Today was supposed to help me figure out who in this family deserves to inherit our legacy. The mention of inheritance changed the entire dynamic in the room. Dorothy had always been quiet about her finances, but everyone knew that her house alone was worth over $600,000, plus whatever investments and savings she had accumulated during 60 years of careful money management. What are you saying? Jake asked quietly. Dorothy smiled again, and this time there was satisfaction in it. I'm saying that I set up today as a test. I wanted to see who would protect a child and who would attack one. I wanted to see who would choose love over money, kindness over cruelty. She gestured toward Tommy, still in my arms with wine-stained cheeks. This little boy passed the test. He was polite, grateful, and willing to share after he had a chance to enjoy his own gift. He showed more maturity than any of the adults in this room. And Atlas? Robert asked, though he seemed afraid to hear the answer. Atlas protected his son, Dorothy said simply. Even when you all pressured him to sacrifice Tommy's dignity for family peace. Even when you threatened to exclude them from gatherings. He chose his child's well-being over your approval. The room fell silent except for the sound of Tommy's quiet breathing against my shoulder. "So here's what's going to happen," Dorothy continued. "I'm changing my will. The original version left everything split between Robert and Jake with small college funds for the grandchildren. But I've decided that's not appropriate anymore." She pulled her phone back up and smiled at the camera. "Let me finish this video with my new inheritance plan just so there's no confusion later. My dad threw wine at my 7-year-old son because he said no. Grandma did something no one expected." Dorothy's announcement about changing her will created a tension in the room that was almost physical. I could feel Jake and Robert hanging on her every word, while Brenda had gone completely still, her face pale with the realization that their behavior had potentially cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. For 63 years, Dorothy began her voice carrying the authority of someone who had outlived most of her critics. William and I saved every penny we could. He ran a successful electrical contracting business, and I managed our investments. We lived modestly because we wanted to leave something meaningful for our family. She gestured around her dining room, which I was seeing with new eyes. The furniture I had always assumed was simply well-maintained was actually antique. The artwork on the walls wasn't just pretty pictures, but original pieces that Dorothy had collected over decades. Even her china cabinet held treasures I had never fully appreciated. "This house is paid for and worth $650,000 in today's market," Dorothy continued. "Our investment portfolio is worth another $400,000, plus life insurance savings accounts and personal property that brings the total estate to just over $1.2 million. Jake's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. I had known Dorothy was comfortable, but I had no idea she was wealthy. Tommy stirred in my arms, but thankfully seemed to have tuned out the adult conversation in favor of examining the pattern on Dorothy's wallpaper. "My original will," Dorothy explained, "left everything split equally between my two sons with $25,000 each for Kyle and Tommy's college educations. I figured Atlas was set financially after his divorce settlement based on what Sarah had told everyone." Robert found his voice. "That's still the right plan, Mother. Atlas doesn't need what?" Dorothy interrupted. "He doesn't need help raising his son. He doesn't need relief from working 60 hours a week just to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. He doesn't need support from family members who are supposed to love him." She turned to face me directly. "I've been watching you struggle, Atlas, while your family criticizes every decision you make. I've seen you wear the same 3 shirts to every gathering because you can't afford new clothes, but you still saved for months to buy Tommy that helicopter. I've watched you skip meals when you visit so there's more food for everyone else thinking I wouldn't notice." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. I had thought I was hiding our financial struggles better than that. "So, I've decided on a new plan," Dorothy announced. "Atlas and Tommy will inherit this house and 50% of the estate. Robert and Jake can split the remaining 50%. The explosion of protests was immediate. "That's not fair," Jake shouted. "Atlas has only been part of this family for 32 years. I've been your grandson for 35. "I'm your son," Robert added. "This house should stay in the direct family line." Brenda jumped in with calculated concern. "Dorothy, you might be making this decision while you're upset. Maybe you should wait and think about it more carefully." Dorothy laughed, a sound that held 6 decades of patience finally running out. "I'm 84 years old, not senile. I've been thinking about this for months, and today confirmed everything I needed to know." She looked at each of them in turn. "Robert, you threw wine at your grandson because he wouldn't give away his Christmas present. Jake, you laughed when it happened. Brenda, you spent the morning teaching an 8-year-old to feel entitled to other people's belongings. None of you deserve to inherit anything from me." "What about Kyle?" Brenda asked desperately. "He's your great-grandson too. Why should Tommy get everything when Kyle gets nothing?" "Kyle will get his college education paid for," Dorothy replied. "But Tommy will get security, stability, and a place to grow up where people don't throw things at him for having boundaries." I was still processing the magnitude of what Dorothy was offering. A house would mean Tommy and I could stop renting, Security would mean I could maybe cut back my work hours to spend more time with my son. But there was something about the way she was presenting this that felt like another test. "There's one condition," Dorothy added, and I knew the other shoe was about to drop. "Of course there is," Jake muttered. "Atlas," Dorothy said, turning to face me directly. "I'll only leave you the inheritance if you cut all contact with Robert and Jake. I won't have my money supporting people who abuse children, and I won't risk them taking out their resentment on Tommy in the future." The room fell silent. Dorothy was asking me to choose between financial security for my son and maintaining relationships with my father and brother damaged as they had become. "You can't be serious," Robert said. "You're asking Atlas to choose money over family." "I'm asking Atlas to choose his child's safety over toxic relationships," Dorothy corrected. "If you all continue having contact, the inheritance goes to the Denver Children's Hospital instead." Brenda sat down heavily in her chair. "So we lose our inheritance and our family relationships." "You lost your inheritance when you decided to abuse a child," Dorothy said bluntly. "Whether you lose family relationships depends on whether you can figure out how to treat people with basic human decency." I looked down at Tommy, who had been remarkably quiet through this entire discussion. His Christmas sweater was still damp with wine, his hair still sticky with burgundy liquid that would probably stain. But his eyes, when they met mine, held something that broke my heart, hope that maybe finally someone would choose him first. "Dorothy," I said carefully, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I can't accept an inheritance with strings attached. And I won't let money dictate my relationships, even if those relationships are complicated." The room seemed to hold its breath. "However," I continued, "I also won't continue exposing Tommy to people who think throwing things at children is acceptable behavior. So regardless of money, we're done with family gatherings where Tommy gets treated like a target for adult frustration." Dorothy smiled, but instead of looking disappointed, she looked pleased. "That's exactly what I hoped you would say." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused by her reaction. "I mean," Dorothy said, pulling her phone back up and stopping the recording, "that was the real test. I needed to know if you would choose principles over profit. And since you passed, you're getting the inheritance without any conditions whatsoever." The room erupted in chaos as Robert and Jake began shouting over each other, but Dorothy wasn't finished. "Also," she said loudly enough to silence them, "I'm pressing charges against Robert for assault, and this video is going to both the police and to Atlas's divorce lawyer for custody documentation." That's when I realized that Dorothy hadn't just been protecting Tommy today. She had been protecting him for the future, making sure he would never again be vulnerable to family members who saw him as less deserving of basic human dignity. Standing in Dorothy's dining room holding my wine-soaked son while my family imploded around us, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced since my divorce. The choice Dorothy had presented wasn't really about money versus family relationships. It was about what kind of man I wanted to be and what kind of childhood I wanted Tommy to remember. "Dorothy," I said, setting Tommy down but keeping my hand on his shoulder, "I need you to understand something. I won't take your inheritance if it means cutting ties based on your conditions rather than my own decisions." Robert seized on this immediately. "See, Atlas is being reasonable. We can all work this out as a family. But," I continued, "I'm done with people who think my son is an acceptable target for their anger. Tommy and I will be limiting our contact with anyone who believes throwing beverages at children is appropriate discipline." Jake stepped forward, his earlier panic giving way to desperate bargaining. "Look, Dad lost his temper. It happens. We can move past this if everyone just calms down." He threw wine at a 7-year-old's face. I said slowly, making sure every word was clear. "Then you laughed about it. There's no moving past that kind of behavior." Brenda tried a different approach. "Atlas, think about Kyle. He loves Tommy like a brother. You can't punish him for adult mistakes." "I'm not punishing anyone," I replied. "I'm protecting my son from adults who have proven they can't control themselves around him." Dorothy had been listening to this exchange with what I was beginning to recognize as satisfaction. "Atlas," she said, Since you're making these decisions based on your own judgment rather than my demands, the inheritance stands. No conditions, no strings attached. I can't accept that either. I said, surprising everyone, including myself. It wouldn't be fair to Jake and Robert to benefit financially from their worst moment. Fair, Jake sputtered. You're worried about being fair to us. I'm worried about Tommy learning that money matters more than principles, I answered. If I take Dorothy's inheritance under these circumstances, what does that teach him about standing up for what's right? Dorothy smiled broadly, and that response just convinced me that you're exactly the person who should have it. She walked over to where Tommy stood beside me, wine stains now setting permanently into his Christmas sweater. Tommy, sweetie, do you understand what happened today? Tommy nodded solemnly. Grandpa Robert threw his drink at me because I said no. And how did that make you feel? Sad, Tommy said simply, and confused. Daddy always says I should say no when I don't want something. Dorothy knelt down to Tommy's eye level, moving with surprising grace for her 84 years. Your daddy is absolutely right. You should always be able to say no, especially when adults are asking you to do something that doesn't feel right. She looked back up at me. Shh. Atlas, I'm going to be very clear about something. I've already changed my will. The papers were signed yesterday before this gathering ever happened. Today was just confirmation that I made the right choice. Robert's face went white. Yesterday, but you said... I said I was updating my will, which was true. I've been watching this family's dynamic since Atlas's divorce, and I've seen enough to know who deserves support and who deserves consequences. She pulled out her phone again and showed us the screen. I've already sent copies of today's video to my lawyer Atlas's lawyer, and yes to the police. Robert, you should expect a visit from officers within the next few hours. Mother, you can't be serious about pressing charges, Robert pleaded. It was just a family disagreement. It was assault on a minor, Dorothy corrected, and I won't pretend otherwise just to keep family peace. Jake tried one last desperate appeal. What about Christmas? What about future holidays? Are you really going to tear the family apart over one mistake? Dorothy stood up slowly, her expression sadder than I had ever seen it. Jake, the family was already torn apart. I'm just refusing to pretend it wasn't. She gestured around the dining room where broken crystals still littered the floor beneath Robert's chair and wine stains marked her tablecloth. Look around. This is what your idea of family looks like. A child covered in alcohol while adults argue about money and inheritance. Tommy tugged on my sleeve. Daddy, can we go home now? I want to wash the sticky stuff off my face. Of course, buddy, I said, lifting him back into my arms. We're leaving right now. As I headed toward the front door, Dorothy followed us. Atlas, wait. I have something for Tommy. She disappeared into her kitchen and returned with a small wrapped package. I was saving this for later, but I think now is the right time. Tommy unwrapped the gift to reveal a vintage toy airplane painted silver with red stripes. It was your grandfather William's when he was about your age, Dorothy explained. I thought you might like to have something special from your great-great-grandfather. Tommy's face lit up for the first time since the wine incident. Thank you, Grandma Dorothy. I'll take really good care of it. I know you will, sweetheart. As we prepared to leave, Dorothy pulled me aside. There's something else, she said quietly. I've been in touch with your lawyer about the custody arrangement with Sarah. This video combined with documentation of your family's treatment of Tommy should help if she ever tries to claim you're providing an unstable environment. I hadn't even thought about that angle, but Dorothy was right. Sarah had occasionally threatened to seek full custody, claiming I couldn't provide proper supervision. Having documentation of my family's behavior toward Tommy would actually protect our current arrangement. Thank you, I said, meaning it more than I could express. Don't thank me yet, Dorothy replied with a mysterious smile. I have one more surprise, but you'll have to wait to find out what it is. As Tommy and I walked toward my car, I heard Robert's voice behind us. Atlas, wait, we can talk about this. "Dad's sorry. Aren't you, Dad?" I turned back to see Robert standing in Dorothy's doorway looking older and smaller than he had when we arrived that morning. "Are you sorry, Dad? Are you sorry you threw wine at your grandson's face, or are you sorry you got caught on camera doing it?" Robert's silence was answer enough. "That's what I thought," I said, opening my car door and helping Tommy into his booster seat. As we drove away from Dorothy's house, Tommy was quiet for several miles before speaking up. "Daddy, why did Grandpa Robert get so mad at me?" I thought carefully about how to answer that question honestly, without damaging Tommy's ability to trust adults in the future. Sometimes grown-ups have problems that have nothing to do with kids, but they take their anger out on kids anyway. That's not okay, and it's not your fault. "Will we see them again?" "Not for a while, buddy. Not until they figure out how to treat you the way you deserve to be treated." Tommy nodded and went back to examining his new vintage airplane. As we drove home through the Denver snow, I realized that for the first time in months, I felt genuinely hopeful about our future. 6 months later, I sat in Dorothy's kitchen watching Tommy build an elaborate airport on her breakfast table, using his helicopter, the vintage airplane she had given him, and several new aircraft we had added to his collection. The late June sunshine streamed through windows that I now knew would someday be ours, creating patterns of light and shadow across the hardwood floors that Dorothy had maintained for over 5 decades. The inheritance had changed our lives in ways both large and small. Most significantly, Dorothy had invited us to move into her guest house while she arranged for contractors to modify the main house for our eventual transition. Tommy had his own bedroom for the first time since the divorce, complete with built-in shelves for his growing collection of model planes and helicopters. I had been able to leave my high-stress insurance job and start a consulting business from home, which meant being present for Tommy's bedtime stories and breakfast conversations, instead of rushing between office demands and single-parent responsibilities. The legal consequences for Robert had been exactly what Dorothy promised. He faced misdemeanor assault charges and was required to complete anger management classes before he could have any contact with Tommy, supervised or otherwise. The criminal case also strengthened my position in family court when Sarah attempted to challenge our custody arrangement 6 weeks after Christmas. Her lawyer had argued that I was providing an unstable environment by allowing family conflict around our son. My lawyer responded by showing the judge Dorothy's video, demonstrating that I had actually protected Tommy from an unstable environment by removing him from it. The family dynamics had shifted permanently. Jake and Brenda divorced in March after she testified in family court about the toxic patterns she had witnessed and participated in. Jake entered therapy and had begun making what seemed like genuine attempts to understand how his behavior had contributed to the family's dysfunction. He sent letters addressed to both Tommy and me, apologizing for his actions and asking for the possibility of rebuilding their relationship someday. I kept the letters but hadn't responded yet, wanting to see sustained change over time rather than just words on paper. Robert remained bitter and largely unchanged. According to Dorothy, he blamed me for turning the family against him and refused to acknowledge that his own actions had consequences. He completed his court-mandated anger management classes but showed no sign of genuine remorse or understanding. Dorothy had made it clear that until he could take full responsibility for throwing wine at his grandson, he would remain unwelcome in her home. The most surprising change had been in Dorothy herself. At 84, she had emerged from her role as family peacekeeper to become Tommy's fiercest advocate. She taught him chess on Sunday afternoons and told him stories about standing up to bullies during her childhood in rural Colorado during the 1940s. She had enrolled in a senior citizen smartphone class so she could text Tommy pictures of interesting clouds and birds she spotted during her daily walks. Their relationship had become the kind of intergenerational bond I had always hoped Tommy would have with his grandparents. Tommy had thrived in the stability and emotional safety of our new living arrangement. His teacher reported that he seemed more confident at school, more willing to speak up when other children treated him unfairly. He had learned to articulate his feelings better, telling me when something bothered him instead of withdrawing into confused silence. Most importantly, he had maintained his sense of compassion and fairness without becoming cynical about adult reliability. "Daddy, look at my control tower." Tommy called from the kitchen table where he had constructed an impressive airport terminal using Dorothy's salt and pepper shakers, several books, and a shoebox we had decorated with windows and doors. "That's incredible, buddy. Where did you learn to build like that?" Grandma Dorothy showed me pictures of the airport where great-great-grandpa William worked before he started his electrical business. She said he always wanted to be a pilot, but became an electrician instead so he could support his family. Dorothy appeared in the kitchen doorway carrying a pitcher of fresh lemonade and wearing the satisfied smile that had become familiar over the past 6 months. William would have loved seeing his great-great-grandson building airports. He always said Tommy had his curiosity and attention to detail. As we sat around the kitchen table sipping lemonade and admiring Tommy's architectural creation, Dorothy pulled out a manila envelope I hadn't seen before. "I have that last surprise I mentioned at Christmas," she said, sliding the envelope across the table to me. Inside, I found legal documents that took several minutes to fully comprehend. Dorothy had established a foundation for single parents facing family court challenges with an initial funding of $200,000 from her estate. The foundation would provide legal support, counseling services, and emergency financial assistance for parents trying to protect their children from toxic family dynamics. "Dorothy, this is incredible," I said, scanning the paperwork that outlined a comprehensive support system for families like ours. "I've been working with lawyers and social workers for months to set this up properly," she explained. "Too many children suffer because parents can't afford to protect them from abusive relatives or because family courts don't understand the dynamics of emotional manipulation." She pointed to a specific section of the documents. "You and Tommy will be the foundation's first trustees when I pass away. Not because you're inheriting money, but because you understand what it means to choose a child's well-being over adult approval." Tommy looked up from his airport construction project. "What's a trustee? Someone who makes sure money gets used to help people who need it," I explained. "Like kids whose families are mean to them." "Exactly like that." Tommy considered this information seriously before nodding his approval. "That's good. Kids shouldn't have to be scared of their families." Later that evening, after Tommy had gone to bed clutching his vintage airplane and talking excitedly about flight lessons when he turned 16, Dorothy and I sat on her back porch watching fireflies dance around her vegetable garden. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't recorded everything that day?" I asked. Dorothy smiled in the gathering twilight. "I don't wonder about it because I know. Robert would have convinced himself that his behavior was justified. Jake would have forgotten the details and remembered only that you were difficult about sharing. Tommy would have learned that saying no to adults gets you punished even when you're right." She rocked gently in the porch swing that William had built for her 40 years earlier. "The most important thing children can learn is that their voice matters, Atlas. That they have the right to say no to treatment that feels wrong, even when that treatment comes from people who are supposed to love them." "I've been thinking about that a lot," I admitted. "About how many times I accepted bad treatment from family because I thought keeping peace was more important than standing up for myself." "And look what happened when you finally chose differently," Dorothy observed. "You protected your son even when it cost you relationships. You chose principles over profit even when money could have solved your problems. You taught Tommy that his dignity isn't negotiable." As we sat in comfortable silence listening to the summer sounds of suburban Denver, I reflected on the lessons that had emerged from that terrible Christmas morning. Protecting children from adult toxicity had become my primary responsibility as a parent, even when it meant losing relationships I had valued. Teaching Tommy to have boundaries had proven more important than teaching him to keep peace with people who didn't respect those boundaries. Most significantly, I had learned that real family is defined by behavior rather than blood relationships. Dorothy, who was technically Tommy's step-great-grandmother, had shown more genuine love and protection than his biological grandfather. The people who truly belonged in our lives were those who celebrated Tommy's voice rather than trying to silence it. Dorothy stood up from the porch swing and patted my shoulder. "You should be proud of the father you've become, Atlas." William always said that a man's character is measured by how he treats people who can't fight back. You chose to fight for someone who couldn't fight for himself. The next morning, Tommy bounced into my bedroom at dawn, his energy already focused on the day's possibilities. Daddy, Grandma Dorothy said we can plant sunflowers today. She said they grow really tall and the birds love to eat the seeds. As I helped him get dressed for a day of gardening and airplane flying, I realized that this was exactly the childhood I wanted him to remember. Safe, stable, surrounded by adults who protected his innocence rather than attacking it. A place where his voice was heard and respected, where saying no was seen as healthy boundary setting rather than disrespectful defiance. Tommy, I said as I tied his sneakers, what did you learn from what happened at Christmas? He thought seriously for a moment. That it's okay to say no when something doesn't feel right, and that real families don't hurt kids for having feelings. That's exactly right, buddy. And that great-grandma Dorothy is the strongest person in our whole family, even though she's the oldest and smallest. I laughed, recognizing the truth in his observation. What makes you think she's the strongest? Because she protected me when nobody else would, and she wasn't scared of the angry grown-ups. As we headed outside to join Dorothy in her garden, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've made the right choices, even when those choices were difficult. Tommy ran ahead to examine the packet of sunflower seeds Dorothy had bought for their project, his voice carrying across the yard as he asked questions about how deep to plant them and how much water they would need. Watching my son engage with the world from a place of confidence and curiosity rather than fear and confusion, I understood that the most important gift we had received wasn't Dorothy's inheritance or even her protection. It was the knowledge that we deserved better treatment than we had been accepting, and the courage to walk away from people who couldn't provide it. The sunflowers we planted that day would grow to be 8 feet tall by autumn, their faces following the sun across Dorothy's backyard while birds gathered to feast on their seeds. Like Tommy's sense of self-worth, they flourished when given proper care and protection, reaching heights that seemed impossible when we first planted them in the rich soil of our new life. If you've ever had to choose between keeping peace with toxic family members and protecting someone you love, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. How did you find the courage to set boundaries when it meant losing relationships? Your experiences could help other parents facing similar difficult decisions. Please like this story if it resonated with you and subscribe for more true stories about finding strength in difficult family situations. Share this with anyone who might need encouragement to prioritize their children's emotional safety over adult expectations. Together, we can support families learning to choose love over loyalty to dysfunction. Thank you for listening to our story, and remember that your voice matters just as much as Tommy's did that Christmas morning. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is teach our children that they have the right to say no, even to people who should know better.